Hey everybody, welcome to Mondays with Mike. What a day it has been as we watch the landfall of Hurricane Debby, which is remarkable in many ways. And so we're going to talk about all the crazy things that have already happened this hurricane season and why Debby actually, is sort of going down and sort of making some history. So if you're just joining me today, maybe for the first time, I want to thank you for tuning in. We do this once a week, every Monday at 12:30, which airs on Fox Local at 12:30, and then is also posted to YouTube if you're watching it on YouTube, so that you can watch it later if you miss it at 12:30. If you are watching it on YouTube, make sure to download our Fox 26 weather app, as well as our Fox Local Smart TV app. All right, so let's get into it. So this morning at about 6 a.m. Central Time, we saw the landfall of Category 1 Hurricane Debby, 80-mile-per-hour winds. It actually hit 4 weeks after Hurricane Beryl hit the Houston area and hit Texas. It's a little bit different. Like, every storm is different, and we'll talk about in what ways this one is going to bring some different threats to the southeastern U.S. versus what we saw with Hurricane Beryl here. But I wanted to start off with this, something I haven't really heard anybody talking about yet. I mean, I'm sure there are some people out there that have noticed it, but it definitely was something that I started thinking about this morning, which is, so we're on the D storm. So that means we've had 4 named storms so far this season. And look at this. All 4 have made landfall on the Gulf Coast. The first 4 storms. Now, I've gone back through the years. I haven't looked at every single year yet. I'm efforting to do that. But I want to see if this has ever happened before. I mean, yes, we've had some years with many landfalls on the Gulf Coast. I mean, we've 7 or 8 landfalls on the Gulf Coast. In the case of 2020, when we had 31 storms, we had a ton of Gulf Coast hits, but not the first 4, and not one right after the other. So we started out with Alberto right there, which was a tropical storm right at the beginning of the season. Then, of course, we had the infamous now Category 1 Hurricane Beryl that knocked out power to over 2 million customers here in Southeast Texas, and some people were without power for over a week, if not longer. And, unfortunately, we had fatalities here due to multiple reasons: trees down, drownings, heat stroke. So it was a nasty one, even though it was, quote unquote, only a Category 1. Then it was interesting because Chris actually formed down here during the buildup of Hurricane Beryl. So there was so much attention placed on Beryl, moving through the Caribbean. Remember, and it became a Category 5. And so Chris formed very, very short-lived. I think it was only around for a day, but also made landfall on the Gulf Coast. And then, of course, Debby, just turned into a hurricane before landfall and made landfall on the Gulf Coast. So 4 storms, 4 landfalls, the first 4 of the season, and that is exceedingly rare. The other thing that's rare about Debby is that it made landfall on the Big Bend region of Florida, right there. And that's not an area that commonly gets hit by hurricanes, just because it's sort of, most hurricanes end up going to the northern Gulf Coast, or maybe into Texas or across the Florida peninsula. But it's very rare that the Big Bend region has gotten hit. In fact, last year, the same spot, basically, within a few miles, was hit by Hurricane Idalia. That one was a Category 3, so it was a much more dangerous windstorm. But it was the first one in eons that it hit that part of Florida, and now it's been hit twice in less than a year, which is pretty remarkable. Also of note is that we've had 2 United States hurricane strikes, and it's only August 5th. And that also is pretty rare. I mean, yes, there are some years where we have multiple hurricane strikes. I mean, there were some infamous seasons like 2004 and 2005 when we had lots of hurricane strikes, major hurricane strikes, on the United States. But building up to August 5th to have that many is kind of rare. So that's what's going on with Debby. This one is the legacy, I think, of Debby is going to be flooding. And so we'll talk about that. Here's a view of St. Pete Beach. So this is St. Petersburg, Florida. And even though it's been hours since the storm passed, the sea is angry, my friends. So hopefully people are staying out of the water. I mean, there's a huge risk for rip currents and things like that. There was more storm surge that was noted here at this location earlier this morning, sort of pre-dawn, or when the storm was making landfall. Farther up the coastline in Cedar Key, which is near where the eye crossed the coastline, actually on that dirty side, just to the south of where the eye crossed the coastline, that's where they had the most noticeable storm surge. We had a live report from reporter David Martin from Fox 35 in Orlando, and he showed us some of the lingering storm surge flooding that was taking place there in Cedar Key. This part of the Gulf Coast is very sparsely populated. Now, this is not to say that, I'm not concerned about areas that are sparsely populated. Of course we are. But as we saw with Beryl, when a hurricane moves directly over a heavily populated area like Galveston, Brazoria, Harris, Fort Bend, Montgomery County, where you have literally millions of people, it makes a big difference in the impact on everything versus it going into a sparsely populated area where people can evacuate more easily and things like that. This part of Florida is probably the least populated area, other than the Everglades, obviously. But that part of the Florida coastline, I mean, if you go up and down, if you go south of this area where the storm made landfall, you get into Clearwater and Tampa, St. Petersburg and Sarasota, and then down to Fort Myers and all of those, heavily populated areas. And then, of course, the other side of Florida is, very populated from Florida, the Florida Keys and Key Largo up through Miami and then all the way up to Jacksonville. So if you were going to have a hurricane hit anywhere, this is the one where it would have the part where the wind would have the least impact. Now, that being said, rain is going to be a big, big concern with this one. Here's a closer look at what it looked like when it made landfall, which was a little wobbly. Unlike storms that are these big category 3, 4, and 5s that have this well-defined circular eye, that's really, really scary. This one didn't really have that, but it did definitely have an eye visible, and it was sort of wobbly. It almost got like oblong and a little bit wobbly, which is why sometimes when these things, when it gets down to it, it's hard to pinpoint exact landfall locations because it starts to wobble around a lot. So that's a look at the last 12 hours of the circulation of this thing. So this is the radar now with cloud cover turned on. This is the visible satellite cloud cover, and you can see a couple of banding features. These sort of like it's interesting, in the universe, we see things like this forming, like in galaxies. You see spiral bands coming off of galaxies, like the Milky Way galaxy, right? So the way this one is spinning around, you get these banding features. That one coming off of the Atlantic Ocean, and then, let's see, I'm doing this backwards. This one coming off of the Gulf of Mexico. So all of those are going to lead to heavy rain across Florida, but now the concerns are really going to spread to Georgia and to the Carolinas, because this rain coming in off of the Atlantic Ocean may create, hopefully not, but it may give sort of Harvey-like rainfall to that area. And, if you weren't here during Hurricane Harvey, that was the problem with it, is that we had, the center of circulation was over by Austin, but we had rain bands that just set up from the Gulf of Mexico and just parked. And you just got dumped on hour after hour after hour. You ended up getting we got over 50 inches of rain in 4 days, 4 or 5 days. So something like that may happen over there in South Carolina or Georgia, or maybe even North Carolina. We've seen how heavy the rain has been already in Florida. I mean, it's been coming down at a rainfall rate of like 4 inches an hour, 5 inches an hour. So it really has been plenty nasty. Also, there's tornado watch that's still in effect for Florida through the day today. And increasingly so, it's going to turn to a flooding threat. I mean, I think you can get a sense here. So the bottom part of the screen is where the circulation is, but very far removed from the circulation is this moisture coming in off of the Atlantic Ocean. So most of the time we think about Gulf of Mexico, rain bands coming in, but there have been storms like, I remember Hurricane Floyd, which was over 20 years ago, but there are a lot of storms that sort of park off of the Atlantic coast of the United States that can also be tremendous rainmakers. And I mean, even like Hurricane Sandy, which is known as like Superstorm Sandy, I mean, that one also obviously wreaked havoc as it sort of moved really slowly off the east coast of the U.S. Check out rainfall totals, guys. This is just over the last 12 hours. And I did find a bullseye there of 17 inches, 17.2. Now that's radar estimated, but we had a report this morning. Our colleague, Regina Gonzalez from our sister station in Tampa had a report from Sarasota County, Florida, where the neighborhood was like Houston. Like the neighborhood was flooded with maybe 3 foot deep water, to the point that it was in everybody's houses and they had water rescues. And I really thought that it was storm surge flooding. With the amount of flooding I saw, I assumed that it was storm surge. And so I asked her, how far are you from the beach? Because it looks like storm surge flooding. And she said, no, this is just heavy rain. And so I went back and looked, and sure enough, they got caught under an extremely heavy rain band and picked up a foot to almost 1.5 feet of rain that fell over a very short amount of time. And that was just over the last 12 hours. Now you imagine that moving into South Carolina and just parking there for maybe 2 to 3 days, which I'll show you in a minute. Spaghetti plot. So this has been pretty wild to see. The GFS computer model, the overnight run was wild. And actually this goes back a week ago, where it was showing the storm coming up and then just doing like this loop-de-loop over the Florida Panhandle and over Georgia. And it's still kind of picking up on that a little bit. The blue line that you see here is the GFS, the Global Forecast System model. The yellow line that you see is what's called the HWARF. It's the Hurricane Weather Research Forecast Model. And then the white line is the Euro. But what's noteworthy is the divergence there. You want to see everything all coming together, but slow moving storms in a weak steering environment are notorious for, first of all, being very difficult to predict where they're going. Secondly, prolific rainmakers. We've had that in the Houston area, not only with Hurricane Harvey, but also with Tropical Storm Allison. And this could be sort of a similar scenario there in the Carolinas. All right, as far as our local weather, what I want you to know is that it's going to be extremely hot. I want to skip ahead here to the 7-day forecast because we're in for it this week. I mean, we are going to be in for some big time hot weather. We have not hit 100 yet this year, believe it or not. And this week, there's a very good chance we will. In fact, we may even hit 100 today on Monday, August the 5th. And then we're going to have a pretty good chance of hitting it every single day this week, at least in some locations. So that is, obviously going to be a big concern. I did want to share with you the latest forecast track. So bear with me here for a second. I need to hit something on my computer. Here we go. All right, so I did want to share with you the latest forecast track on Debby, which is just sort of reiterating the big concern we have for flooding. So, as of the late morning advisory from the National Hurricane Center, Debby has been downgraded slightly to a tropical storm, although, as you may remember here with Beryl, even after Beryl was downgraded from an 80-mile-per-hour hurricane to a 70-mile-per-hour tropical storm, it was still pretty terrible. And so they're going to be going through that over there in a very similar fashion. As the storm right now is making some progress, let's see, to the north-northeast at 8 miles per hour. That's actually slowed down. So it was moving at 10 miles an hour earlier this morning. Now it's down to 8, and it's probably going to continue slowing down to 5 miles an hour and 4 miles per hour, and maybe even going stationary for a while. Now here's the concern. So you'll see there, this is tomorrow morning, Tuesday. Well, depend when you're watching this. This is Tuesday at 8 a.m. Now look at this. This is Wednesday, and this is Thursday. I mean, it only moves that much in 48 hours, and then even into Friday. So we may end up with a situation here where this thing just is either stationary or it's moving just painfully, like 2, 3, 4 miles an hour. So that's one thing to watch. Another thing that's going to be interesting is notice the forecast track. It might move back out over the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the waters there off the east coast of the U.S. are not as warm as what you get necessarily in the Gulf of Mexico, but there is a current that runs off of the east coast of the U.S. called the Gulf Stream. And the Gulf Stream current is warm water. Just a little strip of warm water there off of the coastline. So if this thing crosses Florida and manages to reemerge over the Atlantic Ocean, then it may strengthen again. So it may be that Debby goes from 80 miles an hour down to maybe 60 or 50 or 40, and then moves off the East Coast and then starts to strengthen again. So that would also bring the risk for flooding and also storm surge flooding to the area. Note also the cone of uncertainty. The cone of uncertainty is based on historical errors. It's not storm specific. So what I mean by that is some storms, like I showed you the spaghetti plot, some storms you pretty much know where they're going. Like when, if you have a storm where the Euro and the GFS and all of our models are all basically pointing in the exact same direction, and there's a clear steering current, then you say, okay, we're pretty positive that it's going there. But you still have the cone of uncertainty based on historical errors, the average error for 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, and out to 5 days. But when you have a storm that's crazy, where you have one model going this way and one model going that way, they're all over the place, the cone is still based on those historical errors. What that means is that this storm has a higher likelihood of ending up outside of the cone of uncertainty. So it may be that even though this cone is really narrow here, it certainly could be that it juts out that way or it goes the other way, based on this weak steering environment that it's going to be stuck in. So it's one of those like residents in Florida, Georgia, and believe it or not, even like Alabama, Mississippi, not even out of the realm of possibility that it could affect Louisiana if it does that kind of loop-de-loop kind of motion and comes back off toward the west. So all of these certainly are possibilities. But our main concern is going to be heat around here. We're going to end up most likely having our hottest week of the year so far. As of today, as of at least before the high temperatures reached, on August the 5th, we have not hit 100 this year. We've hit 98. We had a few days where obviously we got close to 100, but we have not hit 100 degrees yet. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have been rainy. We've had unusually rainy year, as you know. Unusually rainy, especially since late April. So you started with downpours on April the 28th. That caused, all that flooding up to our north and river flooding and all that stuff. And then we've been kind of intermittent, we've had a couple of hot spells, but really it's just been rain and rain and rain, which is where some locations have already exceeded their average annual rainfall. And the year's only, a little bit more than half over. So this week, very likely what we're going to get is like today and maybe tomorrow as well, very light winds, but the winds that we get are actually coming in from the north. Most of the time, you would imagine a north wind would be cooler because that's what we get in the winter time, right? We get a cold front comes in and you get these north winds and everything cools down and dries out. And sometimes gets really cold. But in August, A north wind in August, think about how hot it gets like in Dallas or something. You know, they usually have more extreme heat than we do as far as the absolute temperature. So they'll have, you know, an average of more 100-degree days, for example, than we will, because we have the influence of the Gulf of Mexico. So most of the time here, if we have our very typical summertime southeast breeze, we'll have a high temperature of 95 or 96, and it'll be super humid. If we get these rare circumstances where we get a north wind, which, by the way, is loosely tied in with the hurricane, if we get this light north wind, the air dries ever so slightly. You pull in this hotter air from the north. The air even like has a small effect of a compression effect as it flows from slightly higher elevation to slightly lower elevation, which just pumps the temperature up just a little bit. So it gives us a higher likelihood of hitting 100, and it even means that some locations could get 102, 103. Can't rule that out. Maybe even today, but especially heading into Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Lena DeFlorius, who watches the ERCOT, is sort of like our newsroom person to go to for questions about the electrical grid in Texas and so forth, says that there is, she looked at the output and expected production and demand for Tuesday and Wednesday, and the lines are real close, meaning that ERCOT is going to have to manage, you know, how much power is put online. We're going to have a lot of solar power during the day, not a ton of wind power. They have to make sure that they get the natural gas plants or generation facilities up and running to make sure that we have enough electricity, because people are going to be using it. When you get, most of the time these energy forecasters, they want to focus on the big cities because that's where people are going to be using the most electricity. So like in Texas, you're mainly just concerned about what's the temperature going to be in Houston, in Dallas-Fort Worth, in Austin, and in San Antonio. So you get those temperatures 100 to 105 in all of those cities, that's where you run into big problems. Now, very often it gets super hot down in Laredo, Texas, and Del Rio and places like that. And if it gets to 110 there, it's extremely hot, but the electricity usage is not even going to be close to what you would get in the big cities. So, and remember, Texas, we have our own electrical grid. So the rest of the country is on an eastern grid and a western grid, and then there's the Texas grid. So we're sort of on our own when it comes to that. So hopefully we don't run into any problems, but it is something to keep in mind. All right, a couple people asked me about my family in Florida. They're doing fine. I talked to my mom yesterday. I talked to Neil yesterday. They're doing fine. They had some wind a little bit. They had some rain and not a real big deal. So they really missed out on most of this. So that's good, right? So, but it's gonna be a long season. So before we go, shout out to my mom and Neil. I also want to invite everybody to watch our daily show on Fox Local. It's called Forecasting with Friends, or as we refer to it in the newsroom, FWOOF. And you know, we try to have fun with it. It's a lot of work, to be honest with you. It's a lot of work, but we're going to have coverage of, obviously, of Hurricane Debby all week long, and I'm hoping to have a special guest coming up on Wednesday. So I hope that you'll tune in for that, 11 a.m. Monday through Friday, or of course you could watch it recorded on the Fox Local app. Thank you very much for tuning in for Mondays with Mike. Stay safe out there and try and stay cool.